Chapter 2. Shifting Petals. The first night with the smiling house was uneventful, in the way only very tired nights can be. Jasper worked until the numbers on the clock didn't quite look like numbers anymore. The leaf finally behaved, the color finally cooperated, and he sent off the revisions with a polite, upbeat email that felt like wearing shoes that didn't quite fit. When he finally slid under the covers, the apartment was a quiet, humming box. The fridge murmured, pipes clicked in the walls. Somewhere above, someone coughed with stubborn regularity. The print watched from above the head of the bed. Lying there, Jasper could see it without even lifting his head. The flowers were a blurred band of color in the dark, the house a small pale block with a darker square where the door was. The smile became just a curve, simple and harmless, like a child's doodle of a happy sun. He fell asleep, looking at it. His dreams that night were ordinary. Fragments of emails that turned into receipts that turned into train schedules. A grocery store where all the fruit had faces. His old art school classroom, but the walls were made of corkboard, and everyone was silent, pinning things up without turning around. He woke once, sometime in the deep, thick middle of night, with the feeling that he had forgotten something important. His heart beat a little too fast. His eyes opened into the darkness. The house was there, a gentle shape against the dimness. Still smiling, still small, still. His chest loosened. He didn't know why he'd expected anything else. Okay, he whispered to no one. To the ceiling. To himself. To the house. Okay. He flipped his pillow to the cooler side and drifted back down. Morning came in soft, pale slices through the narrow window. The light made a polite path across the floor, up the side of the bed, and finally brushed the lower edge of the framed print. Jasper blinked awake slowly. His eyes always went to the wall before he fully surfaced. It was starting already, that little habit. Check the smile. Start the day. He stretched his arms overhead until his shoulders popped. His gaze lingered on the print, not really seeing it first, just letting the colors soak in. Then something snagged. He frowned, the wrinkle appearing between his eyebrows before his thoughts caught up. Hadn't there been more yellow there, to the left of the house, and fewer pinks? He pushed himself up on one elbow. The flowers were still a riot of color, but the pattern felt off. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. The wild daisies he'd noticed, his favorites, were clustered now in a small group directly under the left eye window. Yesterday he could have sworn they'd been closer to the door, or further. Or, he exhaled and laughed softly at himself. Wow, already memorizing it? That's normal, right? He said, voice rough with sleep. Of course he would misremember. His brain had been a fog by the time he'd actually hung it yesterday, and he hadn't exactly studied the piece like a crime scene. Still, the unease that had flickered under his ribs when he first noticed that something was different didn't quite go away. He blamed the dream fragments. The feeling of forgetting something important clung to him like static. Swinging his legs over the side of the bed, he padded across the chilly floor to stand directly in front of the print. Up close, the illusion of shift faded. The arrangement of flowers was pleasing, balanced, maybe too balanced if anything. Every patch of color seemed to have a companion elsewhere in the field, little echoing notes. You're fine, he told it, like he was reassuring a skittish animal. You're the same. The house looked back at him, its teal door a perfect oval, its shuttered windows perfectly square, its painted smile perfectly curved. The gold VIP sticker glinted from the torn envelope still sitting on the dresser. He'd meant to throw it away, but each time he passed it, he picked it up, turned it over, then put it back down, as if it might grow text when he wasn't looking. No return address, no clue, just that little embossed word, VIP. He shrugged it off and went about his routine. Coffee. Toast if he remembered. Scroll through emails. Ignore the sinking feeling when none of them were answers he wanted. Every time he glanced up at the wall, the house was in the same place. The flowers, too. His earlier worry began to feel silly. Of course it looked different in different light. Of course certain colors came forward or receded as the day moved. He'd lectured on this once, during a guest workshop. Light changes everything. Check your values. Don't trust your memory. Trust what you see. He smiled ruefully. Apparently he needed his own advice now. By late afternoon, with his eyes tired and his shoulders tight, the room had settled into that muted, late-day glow. The blue in the sky outside his window cooled, and a faint, unseen chill pressed against the glass. Somewhere in the building, someone's radio played a song from another room, all bass and muffled melody. Jasper took a break, rolling his chair back from the table until it bumped into the bed. He let his head fall back, looking up at the print, upside down. Viewed like that, The house turned comical. A little head-standing structure, its door now above its windows, smiling at the ceiling. He squinted. Were the curtains different? Had they always been drawn so evenly? He thought, though he wasn't sure, that yesterday one side had hung just a little lower than the other. A charming imperfection. Now the yellow shapes on either side of the window were matched, perfectly mirrored. He blinked a few times, then sat up properly, heart ticking a notch faster. The curtains, seen straight on, looked normal. Symmetrical, yes, but had they always been? His memory shied away when he tried to pin it down. In his head, the image of yesterday's print overlapped with today's, the two versions refusing to separate cleanly. He rubbed at his eyes with the heels of his hands until little glittering afterimages bloomed behind his eyelids. Too much screen time, he muttered. We're making up drama in paper. When he looked again, the curtains were just curtains. Yellow. Daisies and little repeating lines. He forced himself to stand, to step away from the orbit of the print. He made another coffee he didn't really need. He answered a message from his sister. He sat back down at the tablet and moved pixel leaves around a logo for a yoga studio. The day passed. Night came again, slow and soft. He brushed his teeth under the buzzing bathroom light, thinking of nothing in particular. A song from the radio stuck in his head. The taste of mint gritty on his tongue. Back in the bedroom that was also the living room, he hesitated just a fraction of a second before turning off the lamp. The room fell into a comfortable, familiar dark. Out of habit now, he looked to the wall. The print was mostly silhouette, the frame a darker rectangle, the house a mid-tone block, the flowers a low-textured band. He felt watched, but in the way one feels watched by a stuffed animal, harmless, soft, a presence, not a threat. He slid under the covers, one arm flung over his eyes for a moment. "What did you expect?" he whispered into his elbow, half amused with himself. "For it to jump around when the lights go out?" He laughed once, quietly. The laugh bounced off the wall and returned thinner. The last thing he saw before sleep snagged him was that familiar, fixed smile. This time, his dreams were brighter. He was in a field, that much he knew. He could feel the brush of stems against his legs, the tickle on his ankles. Petals brushed his fingertips when he reached out. The flowers were not exactly like the ones in the print, not copies, but cousins. They bobbed gently as if to greet him when he passed, turning their faces to follow. The sky above hummed, not with words, not with any melody he could place, just a low, ongoing sound, like a distant engine or the world breathing through cotton. He turned in place, slow. For a moment, there was nothing but the flowers and the sound, and color, color, color. Then he saw it. The house. It stood at a distance that wasn't quite distance. No matter how he walked toward it, it remained the same size. Red roof, creamy walls, teal door, smiling. He felt no fear, only recognition, like seeing a print of something online and then meeting the original in a gallery. He waved at it. He didn't know why. The windows glinted, just once, a tiny flash, as if catching sunlight, as if something inside had moved. He woke up with his heart in his throat and the taste of wind in his mouth. The room was dark. The hum he heard was the fridge, not the sky. He lay very still, listening to his own breathing. "Okay," he whispered, as if continuing a conversation from the dream. "Okay, just your brain, that's all." He did not look at the wall right away. He stared at the ceiling cracks, those little river maps, until the urge to check became almost painful. Then slowly he turned his head. The print was a shadowed shape, but his eyes adjusted enough to make out the main forms. The square of the house, the darker patch of the door. A soft breath of night air slipped through the poorly sealed window, making the blinds clack faintly. The frame did not move. The paper did not flutter, and yet, squinting, he thought just for a moment that the darkness where the door was seemed softer around the edges, like the door was no longer a solid painted block, but a space, an interior. "That's ridiculous," he told himself. "There's no light source. How would you even see that?" He shut his eyes tight, then opened them again. The door was just a darker oval, flat, harmless. He rolled onto his back and forced himself to breathe slow and deep, in through his nose, out through his mouth. He counted the breaths, a trick he had learned in therapy during a time when anxiety had been a louder, sharper visitor. By breath 20, he'd convinced his body again. This was fine. By breath 40, he was asleep. Morning found the apartment in a pale haze. Cloud cover turned the room into a box of cool gray. The print's colors were quieter now, less saturated, like someone had turned the volume down. Jasper sat up, hair a mess, t-shirt twisted. The remnants of the dream lingered. The feel of petals, the almost sound of that humming sky, but it faded as he blinked and rubbed his face. He swung his feet to the floor, then paused. The wild daisies. They were now gathered in a small, dense clump right by the house's painted foundation, like an offering at its feet. He was sure, more sure than before, that they had not been there yesterday. First left, then under the window, now here, creeping closer in 3 quiet acts. His mouth went dry. "Okay," he said aloud, tasting the word. "Okay, that's weird." He stood, moved closer, as if proximity would reveal the trick. Up close, the print was exactly what it always had been. Inked on paper, color in flat, tidy shapes. The daisies were well rendered, each tiny petal neatly defined. There were no smudges, no signs of repainting or printing error. No doubling of outlines where someone might have drawn over an old position. He imagined, absurdly, that if he scraped at the paper with his nail, he might peel back layers of previous flower positions, like an archaeological dig. He did not touch it. He stared instead until his eyes burned and watered. Light, he thought. It has to be the light. Yesterday was sunny. Today is cloudy. That changes the way values read, obviously. Or maybe you just assumed where they were and never really looked. His brain supplied more possibilities, eager to comfort itself. Maybe you dreamed staring at it longer than you did. Maybe your mental image is from the dream, not reality. Maybe this is what happens when you don't leave the apartment enough, Jasper. He laughed once, but it cracked oddly in the quiet. On impulse, he went to the table and pulled out his sketchbook. Not the digital one this time, the cheap spiral-bound one with soft, worn paper. He flipped to a clean page, and standing midway between the bed and the kitchen, he began to draw what he saw. The house came first, a simple shape, rough lines. The roof, the windows, the smiling door. Then the flowers, scattered around, the daisies right by the base. He finished in quick, confident strokes. When he was done, he dated the corner. Tiny, neat numbers. He glanced up at the real print, then back down. The sketch was crude, but the placement felt right. If the flowers moved again, he'd know. He closed the sketchbook over the drawing. The sound of the cardboard covers meeting felt decisive. There, he told himself. Now if you're misremembering, at least you'll be consistently misremembering. Work demanded his attention. The client emails did not care about mysterious prints. He answered questions about shade of green and the friendliness of certain fonts. He sent thumbnails for a potential children's book cover, animals in backpacks, a bus that grinned, and pretended not to flinch at the memory of the last rejection. Every so often, when his eyes ached or his hand cramped, he'd lean back in his chair and let his gaze drift up. Once, around noon, when the clouds outside thinned and a soft shaft of light managed to find the print, the windows seemed to catch it. The tiny squares of pale blue turned almost glass-like for an instant. He could swear they shone, like eyes catching a gleam. The sensation of being observed pricked the back of his neck. Not in a heavy, oppressive way. In a subtle, too light, maybe I'm imagining this way. He rolled his shoulders, shook his head, and muttered, "It's glass, of course they shine, you idiot. The frame, the glass, the way the light angle hit, of course." When he looked again, the glint was gone. By evening, the sky thickened into a uniform, dull blanket. The room became dim before he realized it. He flipped on the lamp by the bed, turning the wall into a soft, golden stage. The house seemed cozier in that light. The teal door richer, the cream walls almost glowing. He stood in front of it again, coffee cooling forgotten in his hand. His eyes hovered over the doorknob, that tiny, perfect circle. His head tilted. "Were you always that oval?" he asked it, quietly. Because that's how it looked now. Not a simple dead-on circle, but a slightly turned one. As if it had rotated a fraction, catching a different perspective. He leaned closer, the tip of his nose almost touching the glass. The doorknob was round. It had always been round. He could see the little ink line that defined it. Maybe the shadow was just drawn at a slightly odd angle. That was all. A stylistic quirk. Jasper exhaled, fogging the glass for half a heartbeat. When the fog cleared, the house was the same. Still smiling. Still. He stepped back, suddenly uncomfortable with his own intensity. "This is what you get," he told himself, pacing back to the table. "You want interesting things in your space, and then your brain makes them too interesting." He forced his attention to his tablet, to the projects, to the list of tasks that could be checked off, and therefore made him feel less like he was flailing. Lines, colors, deadlines, concrete things, time thinned, Later, alone with brushed teeth and a glass of water on the nightstand, he stood by the light switch and looked at the print one more time. The unease that had been a thread all day twisted, just slightly, under his sternum. It wasn't fear, not really. More like the feeling of walking through a room you know well and stubbing your toe on a chair that shouldn't be there. "I like you," he told the house, surprising himself. "Just don't be weird, okay?" He flipped the switch. Darkness fell in one soft drop. In the dark, shapes rearranged. His eyes, full of afterimages, painted faint squares and lines where nothing was. He waited, letting the room settle, letting his pupils widen. Slowly, the print resolved out of the gloom. He froze. The house was still a blocky silhouette. But the door, its darkness seemed deeper than the rest. Not just ink dark, space dark, the kind of dark that suggested him inside. His mouth went dry. "Stop," he whispered to himself. "Stop it. It's just contrast. You know better." He knew this trick. He'd used it in his own work. Deepen a shadow against a midtone, and the eye will imagine depth where there is only clever flatness. He turned away, deliberately, and crawled into bed. The sheets were cool against his skin. He pulled the blanket up to his chin like a child, then forced it back to a normal adult level. "That's not eerie," he said aloud, as justification. "Just good design." From his pillow he could see the print only out of the corner of his eye now. It was less threatening that way, less direct. The house's smile was just a curve at the edge of his vision. His heartbeat slowed with the steady metronome of the wall clock. Somewhere in the building, a door closed, a pipe vibrated, the fridge sighed. Then, so soft he almost missed it, something else, a sound, a tiny complaining creak. His whole body went rigid. It was the kind of sound he'd heard 1,000 times, the old floorboard by the bathroom door, the cupboard hinge that needed oil. It came from everywhere and nowhere in a building like this. Wood and metal and age all had their own vocabulary of small protests. But in the hush of his room, in the bell jar of his growing unease, it seemed to come from the wall above his head. From where the print hung, his throat tightened. "Building settling," he whispered, his own voice trembling just enough to betray him. He turned onto his side, facing away from the print. That felt wrong too, like turning your back on a window at night when you're sure something outside is looking in. He squeezed his eyes shut. Another creak, even softer. A tiny hinge try. He'd tell yourself with the stubbornness of someone fighting their own imagination that of course it wasn't the tiny painted door. Because doors on paper don't move. Because prints sent in anonymous envelopes don't rearrange themselves. Because houses with smiles don't listen. He let exhaustion drag him down anyway, because there was only so long the body could stay keyed up on coffee and nerves and shadows. Sleep took him in a series of short, choppy drops. Each time he surfaced, some small part of him listened for that creak again, waiting for proof or denial. Morning, as it always does, flattened the night's sharp edges. Gray light seeped in. The room became itself again. The hum of the fridge sounded ordinary. The clock's ticking turned from ominous to annoying. He sat up slowly, every motion deliberate. "Don't look," he told himself for a ridiculous second. "Just get up, brush your teeth, pretend." He looked. The house smiled back at him. The sky above it was as velvety and even as ever. The flowers were a riot of cheerful shapes and hues. The wild daisies now formed a sort of neat stripe along the base of the house, like a trimmed hedge. His gaze snapped to the door. It was no longer a perfectly shut oval. Somewhere, in the slight curve of its painted edge, in the smallest sliver of darker ink, was a suggestion, a hint. Open, just barely, the tiniest wedge. If he hadn't stared at it so closely the last 2 days, if he hadn't mentally traced its outline enough times to know it like a familiar street, he might have missed it. An untrained eye would have called it stylistic inconsistency, a careless line. His heart stuttered, then resumed a little faster. He stood, bare feet cool against the floor, and moved closer until the frame's edge nearly brushed his chest. The door was a deeper teal along one side now, the far side, as if that edge had been pulled away from the house just a hair, revealing a thin, uneven shadow line. Inside, behind. Impossible, he thought. Absolutely, totally, impossible, he said aloud. Just to hear how it sounded. Ink on paper, that's all. No texture change, no raised areas that would suggest another layer had been added. He pressed his lips together to stop himself from actually touching the glass, from leaving smudges of oil in doubt. His mind did cartwheels, trying to explain. Maybe you misremember the shape. Maybe the doorknob is playing tricks with the perspective. Maybe the dream about walking through that field got tangled with the image of this door, and now they're cross-wired. Maybe this is what happens when you spend too much time alone. For the first time since hanging it, he toyed, very briefly, with the idea of taking the print down, sliding it out of the frame, tucking it in a drawer. Not destroying it, that felt wrong, but just putting it somewhere he couldn't see for a while. The thought made something twist in his stomach. The idea of that bright, strange field, folded in the dark of a drawer, made him oddly sad, as if he'd be shutting something living in. He laughed once, shaky. "Listen to yourself," he said. "It's paper. You're anthropomorphizing paper." He left it on the wall. He left the sketchbook closed, not daring to compare the drawing from yesterday to what he saw now just yet. Instead, he went about his morning, washing his face, making toast, reading half of an article, and retaining none of it. He moved a little faster than usual, as if staying still too long might allow his thoughts to crystallize into something alarming. Every time he turned, though, some part of him knew exactly where the print was. It occupied a quiet, insistent place in his awareness, like a low-frequency sound you only notice when everything else gets quiet. When he did finally open the sketchbook hours later, the black-line version of the smiling house looked clumsy, childish. The daisies in his drawing sat a few inches away from where they clustered now in the print. His heart gave a hollow hop. Proof, his fear said. Or proof, his rational mind countered quickly, that you didn't look carefully the first time. It was such a small change. Laughably small. A millimeter here, a curve there. The kind of subtle shift most people's brains would smooth over without telling them. But Jasper had spent years training himself to see those tiny differences in his own work. To catch when an eyebrow was a fraction too high, when an elbow bent at an impossible angle. The smallest wrong line could ruin the whole illusion. He knew movement when he saw its ghost. The unease that had been a quiet thread since morning, now coiled in his gut, slow and tight. Not a scream. Not a siren. Just a persistent background dread. Still, when night came again, and he found himself standing by the light switch, staring at the smiling house, he didn't take it down. He told himself firmly that he was tired, that he was stressed, that his brain was trying to entertain itself. He flipped off the light. The darkness folded around him. The apartment sighed. The house wore its painted smile against the vague gray. "Tricks of the light," he whispered into the dark, as if the phrase were a charm. The word tricks lingered. The flowers, whatever their true positions had ever been, whispered their colors in the darkened paper field. And somewhere in all that ink and all that stillness, behind a door that looked just the tiniest bit less closed than before, something seemed, if only in the most fragile corner of Jasper's imagination, to be listening.